Well, good morning once again. And today, as we said last time in the conclusion of our session, we are beginning our discussion of none other than Virgil, or in his full Roman appellation, Publius Vergilius Maro. So Virgil, unquestionably, is known as the greatest of all Roman poets, and rightly so. We will, in our discussion, focus mainly in our reading on the Aeneid, the great epic that he wrote in praise both of Rome's glorious, legendary, mythological past, and in glory also of its illustrious imperial present, that is the present of his days, when the Roman Empire was ruled in effect by the first emperor, Augustus. So what I propose to do is first to offer some background on who Virgil was, and then his main works, which we will also give a short review of, and then finally, or it is an end which is also a beginning, we will start reading the Aeneid, or at least some excerpts, some passages from it. I uploaded, albeit belatedly, at least in my standards, the passages that we will discuss last Friday. Now, the reason is that I did so belatedly is that the format of the page was not so amenable or convenient after it was photocopied, so it was not amenable to scanning because it was too wide on the page, so the margins were cut off. So I had to find the correct position, and it took me some time, but the material is there, and I will of course speak of the translation itself, and there are nearly as many well, perhaps they're not equal, but there are many translations of Virgil into English, as there are, of course, of the Iliad and Odyssey. So here in this mosaic, perhaps just for a few seconds, I will turn off the light here so that you can see it clearly. More clearly than before, but still. So this is a 3rd century AD. Is Anno Domini in Latin, mosaic of Virgil sitting between two of the muses, right? So to his right over here is the muse Clio, who is the muse of history. You can see that she is holding a papyrus scroll, perhaps a historical account of something. And to his left is Melpomene, who is the muse of tragedy. We know it because she is holding a tragic mask. We know that in the Greek theater, and the Roman as well, the actors, or men, wore masks. Also used as a means of amplification of the voice. So we know that this is Melpomene because she is holding a tragic mask, and Virgil in between, as though he were the 3rd muse, the muse of epic poetry, and he is depicted as holding again a papyrus scroll containing the first lines of the Aeneid. To be precise, lines 5 to 9, where he asks the aid of the muse in remembering the causes of the great rage of the queen of the gods, Juno, why she caused so much suffering to Aeneas. So this is a very, very famous mosaic. It has been used as the frontispiece, that is the picture on the cover of many books teaching Latin and classical studies. And so he is going to be the object of our discussion, Virgil. Now, Virgil was born in northern Italy in the year 70 BC and died also in Italy, but more to the south of Italy, in Brundisium, in 19 BC. He lived, to use a Dickensian turn of phrase, in the best of times and in the worst of times. Now, the best of, let's say, the worst of times, we will begin. It was the worst of times and it was the best of times. So the worst of times, well, I hardly need mention the civil wars. First, the great conflict between Julius Caesar, who famously crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BC, saying, "Jacta alea est," the die is cast. There is no way to go back now. And the great conflict of Caesar with Pompeius Magnus, and all the bloodshed that ensued. And then in 44 BC, the Ides of March, the 15th of March, the murder, perhaps the greatest or the best known of murders in history, the murder of Julius Caesar by those who had assumed that he was after tyrannical power. And then the civil war that followed between Mark Antony, Octavian, who is the future Augustus, and Lepidus, on the one hand, and the conspirators led by Brutus and Cassius. You only need to read Julius Caesar by Shakespeare to have a very vivid image of that scene. So yet another bloody civil war. And then again, we are continuing with the worst of times, yes? The conflict between Mark Antony, who joined the Egyptian Queen Cleopatra, he and she against Octavian, the great nephew and adopted son of Julius Caesar. There was a decisive battle in 31 BC called the Battle of Actium, in which, of course, Antony and Cleopatra lost, and then Antony committed suicide, and even more famously, Cleopatra that was bitten by poisonous snakes. And then Octavian was recognized as the sole ruler of the Roman world. That is the entire basin of the Mediterranean Sea, with Italy in the middle. So both west and east and north and south of Italy was all Roman imperial territory. And then in 27 BC, the title Augustus, which really means the one who increases, the one who brings surplus, from the Latin verb augeo, augere, which is to increase. So you have Augustus, the one who increases, and by extension, the one who is himself uplifted and increased in power and glory. And then begin the best of times, because Augustus or Octavian was wise enough not to name himself king or tyrant. And the name king in the Latin rex had extremely negative and violent connotations to the Roman people, remembering the last of their legendary kings in what is called the regal period of Roman history, which is mostly legendary. There were kings in Rome, that much is historical, but were they indeed the 7 kings that are traditionally so named? We don't really know. The first one, of course, was Romulus, the founder of Rome, and the last one, Tarquinius Superbus, that is Tarquin the Proud, whose son is the one who was responsible for the revolution, the Republican Revolution, in which Tarquin and his family were banished from Rome, and the Republican regime was founded in their state in 509 BC. So Tarquin the Proud, Tarquinius Superbus, was again responsible, he and his family, for the animosity, the hatred that Romans felt to the concept of king in whose power are concentrated all powers that are in the state. They were all under his authority. So to be a king and yet not to be so called is a very wise stratagem. And that's why Augustus claimed that he did not assume sole power over the Roman world, but that power, he claimed that he restored to the Senate, unquestionable emblem of Republican Rome. So he restored the powers to the Senate, who in turn conferred them back upon him. And he was called not king, but the first of the citizens. The Latin name is Princeps, from which we derive our word of prince. Let me just turn on the light. Yes, so he was called Princeps, that is the first of the citizens. And as I said, from this we have the modern word prince. Even though it did not have, the term did not have these connotations then. He was the first of the citizens. And of course, the founder of the dynasty of the first emperors, so-called the Julio-Claudian dynasty, because it started with Octavian, the adopted son, great nephew of Julius Caesar, hence the Julio-Claudian dynasty. So Virgil was alive in those turbulent times. He saw both the bloodshed, though he did not take active part in it. He was not a belligerent, a warlike type of man. As I mentioned earlier, he was said to be very gentle and delicate, almost feminine in many ways, which served his poetry well. and he saw the bloodshed, the murderous activities that really wounded Rome, and also the restoration of peace and quiet under Augustus. We all know the term, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace that was brought forth in the reign of Augustus, who saw great importance in pacifying the world and in restoring the so-called old Roman virtues of modesty, of earnestness, of piety, which is the Latin, derived from the Latin word pietas, a very important term in the Aeneid, pietas, which encompasses a lot of good virtues. First and foremost, dutifulness, a sense of duty. So, dutifulness, righteousness, devotion, both to God's and family. Now, these qualities are all exemplified and are very well demonstrated in the character of Aeneas, who is a far distant echo of the future Augustus. So the sense of pietas is crucial to the understanding of the character of Aeneas in the Aeneid, and also it reflects upon Augustus himself, seen by tradition as a distant scion, a descendant of Aeneas, the father, the ancestor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty in mythological times. So we will, of course, return to this quality, pietas, but it is a key word in the Aeneid when describing Aeneas. And we return to Virgil, some biographical details. So he was born in 70 BC to a well-established land-owning family. He received the best of education, learning, of course, both Latin and Greek literature, Greek being, of course, the older literature of the two, and Latin, at least in... What? Just a second, if there is someone who is joining us on Zoom, just mute yourself, or I shall do it for you. There, good. So, as I said, he was well versed in Greek and Latin literature. I will not go into the history of Latin literature. I will say, though, that from its very beginning in the 3rd century BC, Latin literature was under the great influence of Greek models, and it is nowhere better expressed than in the works of Virgil, writing in the golden age of Latin literature and especially of Latin poetry. Latin literature was, from its infancy, from its cradle, influenced by Greek literature, and the greatness of the Latin writers and poets was their ability to imitate on the one hand and adapt on the other hand the Greek models. That is, they borrowed Greek forms of expression, of literary expression, in our case, the Latin meter, the hexameter. The hexameter is a Greek meter, which was borrowed by the Latin poets, even as far back as the 3rd 2nd century BC by the great pioneer of epic poets, Aeneid, writing in Latin, of course. So he borrowed the meter and the form of the epic story, the epos, also in tragedy and in theater, drama, themes and subjects of plays were borrowed from the Greek heritage, the Greek literary heritage, and yet so adapted and modeled on Roman principles that they are, in all respects, original Roman creations. So the Romans were, in fact, the pioneers of adaptation, literary adaptation, and translation as well. And in that resides their glory and their claim to fame as literary creators. One of the greatest expressions of this trend is the work of Virgil. So he was highly educated and he wrote to a highly educated audience. So in order to understand Virgil well, you must be a student of classics or of ancient history, because everything that he wrote echoes the past literary heritage on which he grew. So he began his career by writing 10 short pastoral poems called the eclogues or bucolics. Now, the eclogues or bucolics are, write this here, just a second. Yes. So the eclogues are 10 pastoral poems also called bucolics. Are pastoral poems. That is, we often have shepherds in a dialogue speaking of Rome, of the countryside, and praising the new age under Augustus, under Octavian. We also mentioned the most famous of them, the 4th eclogue, which discusses the birth of a child, a miraculous child that will reinstate the golden age in the world. Who that child is or was is still uncertain. The Christians, of course, were very much in favor of seeing this as a prophetic poem by a pagan poet, of course, prophesying the birth of the Christ child. But we can assume that perhaps Virgil had no real such intention. But in retrospect, everything seems probable. So these were the eclogues, all written in hexameter verse, by the way. All of Virgil's works that survive fully are in hexameter verse. So the eclogues, 10 pastoral poems, conversations or monologues of shepherds in the countryside. The next are 4, and these, of course, we said that Roman poetry was modeled on Greek models. So the eclogues are famously modeled on Theocritus. Theocritus a 3rd century BC Alexandrian poet who wrote pastoral poetry. And Virgil, of course, knew the work of Theocritus. He studied it as a boy, and his eclogues, his bucolics are based on the work of Theocritus. Now, the Hellenistic poets were known for their scholarly and learned creations. So to read a Hellenistic poet, a Greek Hellenistic poet, is very difficult. You have to have a lot of mythological, linguistic background in order to fully appreciate what you are reading. And now to have a Latin adaptation of that requires the same. So you have to be a master of the Latin poetic tradition, and also be conversant with the Greek heritage on which it is founded. So to read the eclogues is hard, because to fully appreciate it, you need to have that background. And that's why to read an edition of Virgil without annotations, even if you read it in translation, is really quite impossible. You will not understand what you are reading. You can appreciate the beauty, perhaps, but to fully appreciate it, to fully penetrate the meaning, you must have annotations. And that is something that applies not just to the eclogues, which were, you know, the first literary work of poetic of Virgil. It applies all the more so to his more advanced and mature works, the Georgica, known in English as the Georgics, in which you have the Greek root of ge, which is the earth. The Georgica are poems about the earth, about the fields, the livestock, beekeeping, things that were of interest to a rural community that relied heavily on agriculture. And these are, say, poems of the earth. Sorry. Poems of the earth. And these are roughly modeled on Hesiod's works and days. We said that the eclogues were modeled on Theocritus. And the Georgica are modeled on Hesiod's works and days. Why? Because I remind you, we discussed Hesiod's work. The works and days has, as its stated goal, the instruction of when and how to till the land, when to sow seeds, when to reap crops, and so on and so forth. That was the model that Virgil had before him when he composed the Georgics, the Georgica, the songs or the poems of the earth. And there are 4 such poems. They are greater in length than the eclogues. Let's say between 400 and 470 lines of hexameter each. The 4th Georgic has the famous tale of Orpheus and Eurydice combined in it as an offshoot of the discussion of beekeeping. Virgil ties it very nicely in the end, towards the end of his poem, and you have the account of Orpheus and Eurydice, perhaps the best known part of that 4th poem. And his last work, celebrating the Empire of Rome, is the epic Aeneid. Now, as the name suggests, the Aeneid is the poem about Aeneas, the legendary founder of Rome, or rather the legendary founder of what would be the Roman race, because Aeneas was, we all know, a Trojan. And the purpose in writing the Aeneid was, in fact, the glorification of the current glory of Rome. Rome as it was in its heyday under Augustus. Now, there is a very famous epitaph on Virgil's tomb in Naples that sort of encapsulates his literary activity. It says roughly that he was born in Mantua, that is in northern Italy, and that he then spent time in Calabria, and that he finally rests in Naples, where he is buried. The themes of his poetry were pastures, that is the eclogues, followed by the countryside, that is the Georgics, and leaders, that is the Aeneid, the leaders of men, the epic story in the Aeneid. Now, Virgil enjoyed the patronage of none other than Maecenas, or Maecenas, as his name is pronounced in Latin. So Maecenas was Augustus's, was a nobleman, and he was Augustus's a close friend, and he was entrusted with the task of seeking out literary luminaries that would celebrate the grandeur of Octavian, of Augustus and Rome under his rule. And Virgil was such a poet. And the Aeneid, in fact, or the purpose of the Aeneid is, first of all, to explain the position of Augustus and to justify his power. How? By tracing his descent back into mythological past and reaching Aeneas the Trojan. Now, why on earth should the Roman rule be linked in such great and insoluble bonds to Troy? Well, we have in the Iliad a passage in the 20th book where it is more than implied that Aeneas, the Trojan prince, was destined to survive the war and establish a race of rulers of the world. More specifically, it is when Aeneas is about to confront none other than Achilles. There is a duel between Aeneas and Achilles. I believe we mentioned it when we discussed the Iliad. And of course, Aeneas, great warrior though he is no match for Achilles, the greatest warrior of them all. And it is Poseidon, or rather we should call him by his Roman name now, Neptune. It is Neptune who sees the imminent duel, the imminent confrontation, and he says that Aeneas is destined to survive, and if he should fight Achilles, he would not fulfill his destiny. Now, of course, as is customary in Homer, whenever two great fighters are about to collide in combat. They each have a speech that glorifies their lineage. And of course, Achilles claims to be the son of the mortal Peleus and the goddess, the sea goddess Thetis, whereas Aeneas is equally divinely born. Why? Because he is the son of the Trojan Anchises, a mortal, and of a greater goddess, Venus, Aphrodite. So he has as much claim to divinity as does Achilles. And then after this glorification of descent, they start fighting, and it is then that Aeneas is divinely saved. And why? Because when Poseidon, Neptune, sees the imminent confrontation, he says, and I here quote from the translation of the Iliad by Barry B. Powell. I will speak of his translation of the Aeneid as well very soon. And Neptune says, "Come, let us bring Aeneas away from the grasp of death, averting the fury of Cronus' son," that is of Zeus. "If he learns that Achilles has killed the man," that is Aeneas, "whom destiny calls to escape from this fate." So it is the destiny of Aeneas not to die on the battlefield. "All this so that Dardanus' line," now Dardanus was an ancient ancestor of the Trojans, "all this so that Dardanus' line may not perish in total oblivion. Dardanus dearer to Zeus than all the rest of the children, born as the fruit of his loving embrace with the daughters of men. You know how the son of Cronos now hates the household of Priam. Know too that mighty Aeneas is to hold the rule of the Trojans, he and his children's children for generations to come." So what better proof, what better prophecy than this to justify Roman greatness? Because you should know that the Romans did not, as early as the Greeks, keep record of their history. Sure, they had the 12 tables of law, and they had the lists of consuls and the bearers of public offices. Yes, of course, but they did not have anything that would even remotely resemble the work of Herodotus in the 5th century BC. They had nothing. And when, in the midst of the 3rd century, they saw themselves the masters of a great empire, because you should know, we commonly associate the Roman Empire with the emperors. Of course, emperor and empire have the same etymology, but the empire began long before the emperors. It is founded on imperium, that is military command. It's the basic meaning of imperium. So the Roman Empire first began in the 3rd century BC, with the first Roman province being Sicily, and the ensuing Punic Wars and the gradual expansion of Rome beyond the borders of Italy. The beginning, of course, was more modest, so to speak, with the gradual expansion of Rome in Italy and conquering the peoples of Italy and making them their allies. And then, once Italy was more or less unified, the expansion beyond the borders of Italy began. And that was long before the establishment of the Principate. The Principate is the Principatus, that's the name of the regime, that is the presence of a princeps ruling the Roman world, soon to be known also as emperor. But the empire began before that. So the Romans in the middle of the 3rd century found themselves a great warlike power, and they marveled at their roots. Whence did we come? How did we achieve this greatness? And then the story evolved, which is of course found even before Virgil and the historian Livy in even older accounts, but none so old as 5th century Herodotus. Of course, does not discuss the Romans, but there is no tradition that is really that ancient and recorded for Rome. But tradition has it that it was this Aeneas who even the Greeks foretold was destined to greatness. It was this Aeneas who founded the Roman race. And they relied mainly on this short passage from the Iliad to serve as the foundation of their myth of origin. So much like as the British, I now do not exactly recall by what connection exactly, but the British also view themselves as descendants of the Trojans. Of course, in a much later stage and in a much later era. But this is the way that myths arise. And the record of Aeneas sailing from the burned Troy westward and founding a new nation is also found in the first book of the great historian Livy, also more or less a contemporary of Virgil, working also under Augustus. Now, before we start discussing the Aeneid, we will say again that the purpose was to celebrate the Roman past and to show those pristine qualities of the forefather of the Roman race embodied in the current ruler and master of the Roman Empire, Augustus. Also to link the Roman past with the Greek, the illustrious Greek heritage of the Greek heroic age, because Aeneas, it does not matter that he was a Trojan and not a Greek, but he still belonged to that age of heroes. So it is not only Greece that had an illustrious past, but also Rome had its roots in the great mythical age of heroes. So it all, in a way, comes together and justifies the present glory of Rome. Now, the Eclogues was the first work, the work of Virgil's youth. Next came the Georgics, and then the Aeneid. Now, the Aeneid, the composition of the Aeneid, which is roughly the same length as the Odyssey, slightly shorter. It numbers some 10,000 or so lines, hexameter lines. The composition of the Aeneid occupied Virgil to his death, right up to his death. It took him 10 years. He died in 19 BC. It was said that he was on his way to Athens, and he reached Athens to give the finishing touches to the Aeneid, but then decided to return to Italy. He took ill and died of a fever in Brundisium in southern Italy, the Aeneid being left incomplete. That is, not that he did not reach the end. We have the Aeneid, the 12 books of the Aeneid complete, But there are about 50 instances, 50 verses that are not complete hexameters, as though they still needed revision. So Virgil did not give the final finishing touches, what we would say in Latin, the ultima manus, the last hand, as it were. The polishing of the work was not done by Virgil. And in the biographies that we have of Virgil, which are not historically very credible, but it is claimed that Virgil wanted the Aeneid burned because he was not satisfied with it as it stood, and he knew that he would not be able to give it the ultima manus. So he wanted it to be burned, but Augustus forbade the execution of Virgil's will, and he demanded that the Aeneid be published as it was, as it stood right after his death, that is Virgil's death. And this is how it was really carried out. And to wit, Virgil's text became almost as soon as it was published, a school text that was studied and investigated by students of Latin throughout the Latin-speaking world. That means pretty much all of the known educated world of that day and ever since. So we have to thank Augustus for not listening to Virgil and not committing the Aeneid to fire, because that was what Virgil willed. And if it had been so, who knows how the Western literary tradition would look today, because the Aeneid is so influential and has been influential ever since it was first published, that it is really hard to imagine what poetry, Western poetry, would be like without it. It is, next to the Iliad and Odyssey, the most significant epic poem that was ever written in antiquity, because it contains so much, not only of a reflection of Roman greatness, but it is a source of mythological knowledge and lore that we simply do not have from any other source. Perhaps the most famous of these myths is the destruction of Troy. Where do we find the most elaborate description of the Trojan horse, the penetration of the Greek forces into the walls of Troy? Where do we have it in such elaborate detail, if not in Virgil? Well, the answer is nowhere else, because the poems that were written about these events, and we know that such poems were written, they were called the epic cycle. All of them are lost. We have the tiniest fragments only of these poems, which amount basically to nothing that is substantial. So the only literary description of ancient times that we have of the sack of Troy is in Virgil. Now, Virgil, when it was announced, say the beginning of the 30s of the first century BC, that Virgil was working on a national epic poem, then the elegiac poet Propertius said that, knowing the virtues of Virgil, that something greater than the Iliad was in the making. Something greater than the Iliad was in the making, that is the Aeneid. And anyone who reads the Aeneid and has some knowledge of Homer sees Homer almost everywhere in the Aeneid. It is most notable in the opening line, where Virgil says, I sing of arms and the man. Now, by saying so, Virgil in fact invokes both the Iliad, arms, that is weapons and war, famously the subject of the Iliad, the wrath of Achilles that brought down countless afflictions on the Achaeans. These afflictions, of course, being grievous battles and enormous loss of lives. So arms on the one hand, and the man. Of course, the man is the opening word of the Odyssey. Yes, tell me, muse of the resourceful man, the man of twists and turns, the man of many ways. So Virgil takes both these elements and presents them right at the beginning of his poem. I am singing both of arms and of the man. Only in the case of Virgil, the order is reversed. He begins with the so-called Odyssean part and ends with the Iliadic part, because the Aeneid, comprising in all 12 books, 12 songs, 12 poems, begins with the voyages of Aeneas from Troy to Italy. These are the first 6 books, and then the last 6 books, the second half of the poem, deals with the events in Italy and the wars that were fought between the refugee Trojans and the local population of not Italy as a whole, but of Latium. That's how we pronounce Latium in English. Latium, Latium, that is the region in which, of course, in the future, Rome would be founded. So the description of the wars and the conflicts in Italy is the Iliadic part, with, of course, many Homeric allusions and characteristics imbuing the entire work. There have been scholarly works devoted to the influence of Homer on Virgil. But it is not only the Homeric tradition that influences Virgil's Aeneid, or rather it is not only Homer, the Odyssey and the Iliad that influence Virgil. It is also later epic tradition, like Apollonius of Rhodes and the Argonautica, especially when Virgil in the 4th book of the Aeneid discusses the love of Dido and Aeneas. So that part is closely modeled on the infatuation of Medea with Jason. So it is not just Iliad and Odyssey, it is also the Argonautica that influenced Virgil. And this is that multitude of influence. This is what makes the Aeneid a hard poem to read. It is greatly enjoyable and undoubtedly requires more than one reading to take its effect on the reader. You have to, I remember reading a classical scholar, saying that he has a tradition that he inherited from his teacher of once a year reading the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid every year. In a concentrated effort. I assume he was referring to reading them in the original also, but even if you read them in translation, it would be equally rewarding. Once a year, and with every reading, first you remember the story better, and you go deeper into the meanings, the ways that things are expressed beauty, the artistic beauty of the work, as well as its overall message. And so these are the characteristics of the Aeneid. It invokes both the Iliad and the Odyssey, and it begins with the so-called Odyssey, the voyages of Aeneas. Now, Aeneas is first and foremost Pius Aeneas. He is referred to as Pius Aeneas, that is a man who exemplifies pietas. He is dutiful, he is righteous, and he is devoted both to God and to his family. Maybe one of the best known representations of Aeneas as he is fleeing Troy is him carrying his old father Anchises on his shoulders and holding the hand of his little son Julius, and all three together flee the burning Troy. And that, it's not very much, it's not going to be very clear, but this is a representation of Aeneas carrying Anchises on his shoulders. And this is an example of filial dutifulness. And of course, also fatherly care for his own son. The only one who lags behind and dies as a result is his wife, Creusa. But she died for a cause. And don't think that Aeneas forgot all about her. No, when he was in a hurry carrying his father and his little son out of the burning Troy, he suddenly noticed that Creusa was nowhere to be found. And would he abandon her to the flames? No, he returned back into burning Troy to look for his lost wife, only to find her as a ghost, addressing him and telling him, "Leave me, I die because it is so fated. Your fate is to wed someone else and start a new dynasty in a new place." So Aeneas is the quintessential, I would say, Roman pater familias, that is, head of family. And of course, who is the real current quintessential pater familias? Augustus. So it is this reflection of Aeneas expressed in Augustus himself that is very important to Virgil, and it is even beyond mere allusion. In the 6th book of the Aeneid, where Aeneas has a katabasis. What is a katabasis? It's a nice word. I'll write it. It's katabasis. Greek, of course. A katabasis is a going down. Going down where? Into Hades, the world of the dead. Of course, in imitation or emulation of the famous katabasis of Odysseus in the 11th book of the Odyssey. So Aeneas, being a heroic character on his own, has to have a katabasis of his own, and it is there that, guided first by the Sibyl, the priestess, and then when he is already in the underworld by the ghost of his father Anchises, he sees, or he has a kind of metaphysical experience, seeing souls being reincarnated and seeing future heroes of Rome. He sees the savior of Rome in the Punic Wars against Hannibal, Quintus Fabius Maximus Cunctator. He sees also the great villain Catiline, and also contemporaries of Augustus's time. So it is, in fact, a projection into the future. And that is why the Aeneid is so often called as the, or referred to as the Roman national epic, because it is not only a mythological story as we have in the Odyssey, the Iliad, it also serves a political purpose to justify the House of Augustus, the Julian family, as the first of families in Rome. Why? Because they descend from Aeneas. Good. So this is as far as background is concerned. And now the best thing would be to start having a taste of the work itself. Now, as I said, there are many translations of the Aeneid. I can't say that I know most of them even, but I selected for you what I believe is a great translation to read and to understand the Aeneid. First of all, we will, just a second, we wish to see a taste of the original. This is what the original looks like. So it says here, the first, just a second, the first book of the Aeneid by Publius Vergilius Maro. And it was, of course, written in Latin, not in this way, because Virgil did not know the minuscule letters. He only wrote in capitals. And it is in hexameter. So the first words, arma virumque cano, right, are perhaps one of the best known first lines in Latin poetry. Arma virumque cano, Troiae qui primus ab oris Italiam fato profugus, Lavinia prevenit litora. So, of the many translations that there is one in English, the one that we're not reading from, by the way. There is one in English, a fairly recent one, I believe, of the first decade of the 2000s, of the year 2000, done by Frederick R, that is A-H-L, written in English hexameter verse. That is, he tries in English to retain the music, the musicality of the Latin hexameter. Now, as far as English hexameter is concerned, I believe it is easier to read Latin hexameter than English hexameter, but once you become accustomed to the meter, it sounds really well. And so he translates as arms and the man I sing of Troy, who first from its seashores Italy bound, fate's refugee, arrived at Lavinia's coastlands. How he was battered about over land, over high deep seas, by the powers above. Savage Juno's anger remembered him, and he suffered profoundly in war to establish a city. Settle his gods into Latium, making this land of the Latins future home to the elders of Alba and Rome's mighty ramparts. Again, I believe that this was perfect English hexameter verse. It's the same music as the Latin, arma virumque cano, Troiae qui primus aboris, Italiam, etc., etc. And the translation that we are going to read from is not in hexameter verse. It is not in prose, but it is a form of English poetry. There are more or less 6 beats in the line, but it is, I believe, not necessary to follow those beats to enjoy the translation. And you will see that it is easier to understand than what I've just read to you in English. The translation is the one that was done by Barry B. Powell. And if you really want to enjoy the Aeneid and to understand it as much as possible, even in a first reading, then I would recommend this translation. Again, it is a fairly recent translation. It was published in 2015. Yes. No, sorry, 2016 by Oxford University Press. A very good translation, intelligible, straightforward, and, at least to my mind, very accurate and precise. And so this is the translation that I selected. Barry B. Powell. I can write his name over here. Powell. Barry B. Now, he also has equally fine translation, readable and reader-friendly, of the Iliad and of the Odyssey. Again, they are annotated, as I am sure you saw for yourselves in the excerpts that I photocopied. They are annotated on the same page, which is a great help. Here. So they're annotated on the same page. At the beginning, the annotations are very copious and elaborate, but they're very helpful because you cannot really understand the Aeneid fully if you are reading it unaided by the annotations. So, I sing of arms and of the man who first came from the coasts of Troy, exiled by fate. So this is the Latin, arma virumque cano, Troiaeque primus aboris, who first came from the coasts of Troy, exiled by fate to the Lavinian shores. Okay, Lavinian shores are the shores of Lavinia. Lavinia would be Aeneas's future wife. So Lavinian shores are in fact the poetic way of naming Italy, the Lavinian shores. That man was much tossed about on land and on the deep by the might of the gods. So again, like Odysseus before him, he experienced great toils both on land and on the sea, on the deep. Why? By the might of the gods. And especially because Juno would not forget her rage. The Latin is saevai memorem Junonis ob iram, because of the mindful rage of Juno, of cruel Juno, saevai Junonis, the mindful rage of cruel Juno. Now, why would Juno be enraged? Well, this brings us again to the requirements of that Virgil has of his readers. You must be familiar with the judgment of Paris, which we, of course, explained. Again, Paris, the Trojan prince, was elected to decide who the fairest of the gods was, of the goddesses, sorry, was Juno, Minerva, or Aphrodite. That is Hera, Athena, or Aphrodite, Venus. And he, of course, selected Venus, thereby acquiring the perennial hatred of the two that were not selected. That's why Hera, Juno, and Athena, Minerva, are on the side of the Greeks in the Trojan War. And even after Troy was destroyed, Juno still harbors that hatred. It is a hatred of the Trojan race on the one hand that propelled Juno, and a love for the Carthaginians. So Carthage is a city dear to Juno, and she knows that in the distant future, that beloved city of hers is destined to be destroyed by the nation whose ancestors are now sailing the seas. That is why she wants to place obstacles in the realization of that destiny. She knows, I'm sure, that she cannot really impede the course of fate, but as Poseidon did with Odysseus, she can at least make the protagonists suffer and detain the fulfillment of what is destined to be. So that is the meaning of Juno would not forget her rage, and he suffered much from war to found the city and bring his gods to Latium. Now, Latium, that is the area, the region in Italy, whence came the Latin race, the fathers of Alba Longa and the high walls of Rome. So there is also a question of chronology, very complicated one. When exactly do we place Aeneas in time? There are differences, but Virgil knew that if Aeneas was part of the Trojan War, and the Trojan War was traditionally believed to have taken place in the end of the 12th century BC. And Rome was founded some 500 years later. So Aeneas could not be the founder of Rome. There had to be a dynasty of descendants from Aeneas to the founders of Rome. And so Aeneas brings his god to Latium, that is the region where future Rome would arise. And first, the Latin race is formed, and then the fathers of Alba Longa. Now, Alba Longa was a city founded by Aeneas's son, Julius. And there was a line of kings in Alba Longa from whom were descended Romulus and Remus. And it was they who founded Rome, or rather, more precisely, Romulus who founded Rome, but it was they who had the idea of founding a new city. And we know the story, of course, the killing of Remus by his brother Romulus, whether it was he who killed him in person or there was a skirmish there in which Remus died, we do not know. But we do know that it was Romulus who lived to found the city of Rome. And so this short proemium, you see that Virgil follows the epic tradition in having a proemium stating the subject of his poem, Arms and the Man who first came from the coasts of Troy. So in that short proemium, we have a link between the mythological past of Greece and Troy, the man who came from Troy, and just a few lines later, he brought his gods to Latium, whence came the Latin race. fathers of Alba Longa and the high walls of Rome. So we begin with Troy and we end the proemium with Rome. So the connection, the link is established right at the very beginning. And then, like all good epics, we must have an invocation to the muse, saying, Musa mihi causas memora. O muse, remind me of the cause. Quo numine laiso quidque dolens, because of what insult to her divine power? Suffering what exactly did the queen of the gods drive on a man famous for his sense of duty, pietate, to withstand so many disasters, so many pains? So in his introduction to his translation, Powell says that because of the multitude of implications embedded in the word pietas, he chose to translate it sometimes as dutifulness, sometimes as righteousness, or to employ several translations to the same Latin word. And that's why, because it is a key word in the Aeneid, he mentions the Latin term every time it appears in the translation. So here it is sense of duty, pietate. Here it is in the ablative case, but the word as a dictionary entry appears as pietas. Pietate is just an inflected form of pietas. It's the same word, but you will see that a few more lines, when the same Latin word appears, perhaps the English translation would not be duty. Perhaps it would be righteousness, or perhaps it would be devotion, all to suit the context. Now, Latin, which is a very challenging and difficult language to study, is nonetheless not so rich in vocabulary, which is also part of its difficulty. The vocabulary of Latin, compared, say, with that of Greek, is very, very small. Greek is very modest. Greek is very opulent in vocabulary. There are words for nearly everything. Latin, no. By comparison, Latin is poor in vocabulary. And that is why when you translate such a work as the Aeneid, you would sometimes be required to use different words in translation to reflect what in Latin is the same word. And because pietas is a key characteristic of Aeneas and by extension of Augustus, the translator has decided that wherever it appears, he will mention the Latin word, and we will see how he chose to translate it, to convey its meaning in that particular context. So the question is, or the request of the muse is to say why. Why is it that Juno, why was she offended? What was the great insult that was inflicted upon her that she decided to drive on a man famous for his sense of duty to withstand so many disasters, so many pains? Do the gods hold such anger in their hearts? Can it be that the gods harbor so much anger in their hearts? Well, now comes the explanation. There was an ancient city, Carthage. So see how Virgil, in the very beginning of his epic, manages first to establish the connection between Rome and Troy, and also he mentions what was the greatest conflict and the greatest threat to Roman power in what the Romans knew of their past. And that, of course, was the conflict with Carthage. So that too is mentioned at the very beginning of the epic. There was an ancient city, Carthage, settled by colonists from Tyre. So Carthage also is a colony, an ancient colony of the Phoenicians from Tyre, opposite Italy and the harbors of the Tiber, rich in wealth and excellent in the study of savage war. So again, Virgil establishes the characteristics of Carthage. Excellent in the study of savage war. Juno is said to have cherished this city more than any other on earth, including Samos. Samos, we know from the Iliad, was a beloved island of Heres. Here were her armor, here her chariot. The goddess wanted Carthage to hold power over all other peoples, if only fate would allow it. But we know from the Iliad that it was Aeneas and his descendants who were destined to become masters of all. Contrary, of course, to the wishes of Juno. She wanted that Carthage would hold power over all other peoples, if only fate would allow it. Even then, she cared for Carthage. She favored her. But she heard that an offshoot of Trojan blood would come, who would one day overturn her Tyrian towers. Now, again, this epic tendency of applying different names to what essentially is the same thing. Tyrian towers is a poetic way of referring to Carthage. Why? Because Carthage was founded by colonists from Tyre, and what is now the city of Carthage, featuring battlements and castles and palaces, Tyrian towers. So she now knew, or she heard, that an offshoot of Trojan blood, that would be the Romans, would come, who would one day overturn her Tyrian towers. That from this line would come a people wide of rule and proud in war, who would one day come to destroy Libya. Now again, Libya stands for Africa and also for Carthage. Carthage, Libya, Africa, they are all, for our purposes, synonymous. For the fates had spun it so. So once it is fate, and now we have the fates. You know, the Latin is parakai, the Greek is moirai, those who give us our lot, who decide for each one of us how our lives are going to be. So the fates had spun it so. Now, fearing this, the daughter of Saturn was aware of that earlier war when she had helped the Argives at Troy. She could not let go of the causes of her anger or shake the terrible pain from her heart. So we have, on the one hand, as I told you, the love and wish to cherish Carthage, to make the city of Carthage great and mistress of all, and not that city that would be descended from Aeneas. So that is on the one hand. And on the other hand, we have still the savage memory, the cruel memory of the judgment of Paris was always on her mind. And the injury done to her beauty, so despised by that hated race. So again, Paris, Aeneas, they're all the same in Juno's eyes. They are of the same race, that hated race of the Trojans. And the honors given to Ganymede when Zeus snatched him away. Now, Ganymede was again a very beautiful Trojan boy who filled Zeus's eyes, so to speak. And what does Zeus do when his eyes are filled by some, well, good-looking boy or girl? There's no question, he snatches them and makes them his own. So Zeus snatched Ganymede and made him his cupbearer. And Ganymede, being Trojan, of course, incurred the anger of Juno. So it is not only that it was a Trojan who despised Juno's beauty, but a Trojan prince attracted Zeus, her husband, her brother and husband. So all the more cause to hate the Trojans. Snatched him away, you see. Now, infuriated by these things, still more, she kept the Trojans far from Latium, tossed everywhere over all the seas. Those who were left after the Danaans and savage Achilles were through, just a second. Yes. We're through with them. Okay, so let's say also that when the Aeneid begins, it is, if I remember correctly, the 7th year of Aeneas's wanderings. So Aeneas has been wandering from Troy in search of his destined home, his destined new kingdom, for 7 years. And it is at this point that the Aeneid begins. Okay, so she sees them on the deep. Juno sees them on the deep. They wandered throughout the many years, driven by the fates around every sea. Tantai moli serat romanam condere gentem. That's the famous line in Latin. So great a labor it was to found the Roman race. So they are already 7 years in wandering, seeking out where is the promised land. They've been through a lot throughout the many years, driven by the fates around the sea. And then to sum up that opening passage, Virgil concludes with an aphorism: so great a labor it was to found the Roman race. It did not begin easily, and it is also a mark of Roman determination that no matter how hard the task at hand is, it is perseverance that will lead us to success and to survival. So great a labor it was to found the Roman race. And now the actual story begins, where the fleet of Trojans are leaving Sicily. And of course, we will know as we continue, if you continue reading the Aeneid for your own pleasure, you will know how they reached Sicily. So now they're leaving Sicily, was scarcely out of sight. Joyfully, the Trojans turned their sails toward the open sea. The bronze on their prows cut through the swells of the salt sea, when Juno, savoring the endless hurt in her heart, said this to herself. And now it is a monologue, a soliloquy that Juno is having with her own self. So, am I to pull back from my design? Beaten down, can I then not turn away this Teucrian king from Italy? Now, Teucrian is another synonym for Trojan. Of course, fate forbid it. But Pallas could burn the ships of the Argives and drown the men in the sea, all on account of the offense of one man, the madness of that Ajax, son of Oileus. She herself, casting the sudden fire of Jove from the clouds, blasted his boats and overturned the sea with winds. She took him up in a whirlwind as he spewed out flames from his breast. Transfixed, she stuck him on a sharp crag. So Juno is now trying to justify what is about to happen. She's about to inflict some more suffering on the Trojans. And even though she knows that fate forbids it, she has past precedents to rely on. Look, Pallas Athena could take her revenge on Ajax, son of Oileus, who desecrated her or who offended her in the past. And this is what she did to him. And if Pallas Athena could do so, I, who move as queen of the gods, the sister and wife of Jove, I've been at war with one people for so many years. Who will respect the godhead of Juno after this, or will come as a suppliant to place offerings on my altars? So it is a matter of principle with Juno that she should inflict more disaster and greater harm on the Trojans before they fulfill their destiny. They will fulfill their destiny, but only after she has had her fill of revenge. Very well. I will stop here, and next week we will continue our discussion of the Aeneid and discuss also the fall and sack of Troy. Great, so till that time, farewell.